Welcome, welcome back to the second workshop of this creative writing course. Last week we covered a general introduction to creative writing about finding your inspiration. And today is all about characterization, which is the process of creating and developing characters. As an author, we want to create characters that are authentic, are believable and real, that our readers can relate to, or at least they have some kind of emotional thought or feeling or opinion or a reaction when they come into contact with those characters. So in this workshop, we're going to cover four main aspects of developing characters, and I'll come on to that in a few moments. So characters are so important to any story. Can you imagine a story without characters? It would be pretty boring, and it would be almost impossible, I think, to write a story without characters, although I'm sure there are stories out there. And there are many different types of characters that we can create as authors. The most obvious is the hero, who is often the lead character in a story. But you can have, sidekicks, loners, characters who are a bit more complex, perhaps an anti-hero. You have characters that are funny or spiteful, or very clever or conniving. It's important that if we introduce characters into our stories, they've got to add something to the overall narrative. There's no point just having characters for the sake of it. And always remember as authors that we create characters simply by using the power of words. We describe our characters. We inform the reader about the actions our characters take in our stories simply by using words. And we can use different types of words to generate the thought or the feeling or the reaction from our readers that we want. You'll find in most books that when an author introduces a character, they'll often describe what that character looks like. And this immediately helps the reader to visualize the character. And the reader then starts to paint a picture in their head of that character as they then move through the story. Let me give you an example from Odd Socks. So this is Mr. Foot, who is one of the main characters. And this is right at the beginning of the story. So Mr. Frank Foot was the head of the family and the chairman of the Foot Empire. He was a big fat man with a bald head, and his face closely resembled a wrinkly leather beetroot. He wore thick-rimmed glasses, smoked giant cigars, and scared the living daylights out of everyone. So there I've described the physical appearance of Mr. Foot. So very early on in the story. So now the reader has a visual identity of Mr. Foot in their mind as the story progresses. And I've also gave the reader a kind of glimpse into what type of person Mr. Foot is. So you can try this as an activity at home. You can think about who was the last person that you met or spoke to online or on Zoom, who you don't live with. So it could be a teacher, it could be a colleague, it could be a friend, someone you spoke to on the phone. As an activity, I would like you to describe that person. Write it down on your paper at home, and describe them as if they were a character in your story and you were introducing them to the reader for the first time. This is a good exercise because it helps us to think about how we develop characters. And this is kind of introducing a character into a story. And you can create characters from people you've met in real life, or from books you read or films you watch. We can create characters from and be inspired by so many different aspects of our lives. So try that as an exercise at home. Think about someone who you've been in contact with who is not a member of your immediate family, and just write down, describe them, how you would introduce them if they were a character in your story. It's a good exercise to do. So what I'm going to cover mainly in this workshop, like I said, is the 4 main aspects of developing characters. And I'm going to read them out now, and then I'll talk about each of them in more detail. So number 1 is descriptions. So kind of like that activity there, how we describe our characters, both in terms of their physical appearance, but also in the actions they take and in the manner in which they perform those actions. That can really bring our characters to life. Number 2 is tone of voice. So how do our characters talk? How do they communicate and interact in the story? Again, this should reflect the character's personality. Number 3 is the relationship the characters have with each other, and the dynamics between different characters, which again can elevate different traits and different layers in characters' personalities. And then finally, number 4 is the contrasts and contradictions within characters. And I think that's where it gets really interesting, because then we can make our characters, you know, like real people who are complex and will sometimes do something completely out of character. And it's important that we try and reflect that in the characters that we create. So let's start with number 1, descriptions. So, you know, when we, like you've done in the activity there, where you've described the physical appearance of a character early on in the story, when that character first enters the scene and enters the narrative. But as an author, that doesn't mean our job is done. You know, we've described what that particular character looks like. It doesn't mean that our job is done and now the reader has this visual identity in their mind, and we don't need to do anything else on that. We can build on that as we move through the story by adding further references to the character's appearance. For example, if I bring back Mr. Foot in Odd Socks, you know, at the beginning of the story in page 2, I've told the reader what Mr. Foot looks like, gave the reader a bit of a inkling into his personality. But then throughout the story, I will describe his appearance to kind of elevate and get across to the reader how Mr. Foot feels at that moment in the story. So here's an example here. On page 168, his fat red head had turned purple. His eyes bulged as he straightened his tie, dusted his collar, and brandished a megaphone like a weapon. So I've used Mr. Foot's physical characteristics and appearance to bring to life for the reader how Mr. Foot feels at that moment in the story. So throughout our stories, once we've introduced a character, we can continuously make references to their physical appearance throughout to kind of reinforce that visual identity for the reader. And they're kind of the building blocks. You know, what a character looks like is the foundation of our reader's interpretation of the character. And then we can take that to another level by describing the character's actions in the story and the manner in which they perform those actions. So for example, and just a very basic everyday action like putting a cup of coffee on the table, we can use something like that to great effect to inform the reader how a particular character feels at that moment. So here's an example. I'm going to create a character called Boris, and we're going to go through 2 different ways of performing the same action, but which result in a different reaction from the reader. So number 1 is Boris slammed the coffee cup on the table. Number 2 is Boris carefully placed the coffee cup on the table. Now, in this instance, we know nothing about Boris. We don't know where he is or who he is with. But just from that one simple description of the way he put the coffee cup on the table, we immediately get a sense of potentially how he's feeling or even what type of character he is. Let's add another dimension to that and build on that some more. So first example is Boris slammed the coffee cup on the table and let out a heavy sigh. Example number 2 is Boris carefully placed the coffee cup on the table and smiled. So just by adding literally 2 or 3 additional words to that sentence, to that description of the action of putting the coffee cup on the table, we've elevated how Boris is feeling in that moment. So I hope that makes sense. That's all about using descriptions of both physical appearance and the actions a character takes to create an aura, a personality for a particular character. So it's to summarize, we use words to describe what a character looks like. So we describe their physical appearance. And then we use words to describe what a character does and the manner in which they do those things. And this can really enhance a character's personality and give a character quirks. You know, a character may have a particular way of holding their coffee cup, which might add an element of comedy, for example, or they might have very shaky hands and you can incorporate that. So there are lots of different ways we can incorporate simple things like actions, like putting a coffee cup on the table, which give our characters another dimension. So as an activity at home with the character that you've created, which you've based on a person that you've recently met or spoken to on Zoom, a colleague, a teacher, you know, think about how that character that you've created there could do something simple like put a coffee cup on the table. So write that down. How would that character place the coffee cup on the table, and write it in a way which reflects how you want the character to feel in that moment. So if the character is going to be happy or angry or frustrated or sad, write it in a way which kind of elevates that emotion. So that's descriptions when we're thinking about developing characters. Now we move on to tone of voice. So now once we've built up a visual identity of a character, we can dive even deeper and think about what the character says in our story. So the words that they say, but also the manner in which they say those words, their tone of voice. And creating an authentic voice for your character is really, really important. And we're going to cover that in much more detail in the workshop on dialogue. But for today, we'll do some basics, because when we first start to develop a character, a key thing we need to think about is, you know, how, you know, what do they sound like? What do they say? How are they going to interact and communicate in a way which reflects their personality? So, for example, you may have a character who is a very commanding presence, who likes to take charge of a situation, and that person may speak very loudly or confidently. Or you may have a character who is, you know, more reserved and thoughtful and may speak quietly. So let's bring back Boris and his cup of coffee, and we'll add some dialogue to that very same scene, and let's see. So example number 1 is, "This is ridiculous," huffed Boris as he slammed the coffee cup on the table and let out a heavy sigh. Example number 2 is, "Thank you so much, sir," replied Boris as he carefully placed the coffee cup on the table and smiled. So again, in this instance, we don't know who Boris is or who he's speaking to or where he is. But what we've done here is we've just brought in a little bit of dialogue, some tone of voice, and we've kind of linked that with the action. So in the first example, Boris is clearly not happy. He thinks this is ridiculous. He's huffed, which we've added as a tag to the dialogue. And I'll talk about that in more detail during the dialogue workshop. But he's also slammed the coffee cup on the table. And then in the second example, Boris is clearly, you know, happy. He's thanked the person he's speaking to. He smiled. And so again, we've just these, it might sound very obvious and basic and simple, but actually if we can scrutinize our writing to make sure we can maximize every single sentence and word that we write down to elevate emotion and feeling for each of the characters, we can really make our writing go so much further. So that's tone of voice. So now we've built up a bit of a visual identity. We've gave our character a way of expressing themselves, a tone of voice. Now let's move on to how we form relationships and dynamics between different characters. And this is where it gets really exciting, because the relationship your characters have with each other will bring out different personality traits and new layers. So let's just explore this. We're going to go back to Boris and his cup of coffee, but we're going to introduce Boris's friend called Barry. And we're going to use the same example, the same scene, but we're going to bring Barry into the conversation. Here goes. So number one is, "This is ridiculous," huffed Boris as he slammed the coffee cup on the table and let out a heavy sigh. "You'll be great, Boris," smiled Barry. "I have every faith in you." Example number two is, "Thank you so much, sir," replied Boris as he carefully placed the coffee cup on the table and smiled. "You'll be great, Boris," smiled Barry. "I have every faith in you." So here we have exactly the same response from Barry to each of those in each of those examples. But because of the way Boris has reacted to whatever it is he's reacting to, it also gives the reader a different feeling towards Barry. Because for me, in the first example, where Boris is clearly not happy, he thinks it's ridiculous, he slammed the coffee cup on the table, Barry simply smiles and says, "You'll be great, I have every faith in you," which to me suggests there's something a bit more sinister there, or maybe Barry doesn't really like Boris, or maybe they just don't see eye to eye. But in the second example, everything seems pretty jovial, and they seem to be getting on. Boris is grateful, Barry is grateful, everyone's happy. So just by simply adding a character and kind of almost making those characters bounce off one another, we can further build a kind of profile for each of our characters. So when we start to introduce another character into the mix, it not only develops that new character, but also adds new dimensions to the other characters in the story. So when we create these dynamics, we start to unpeel the layers of their personality, and our readers will form their own view. You know, they may side with a particular character. They may decide that they like Boris, but they don't like Barry, for example. And that's what we want to do with our readers. We want them to be invested in those relationships because it pulls them in to the story. So that's when we want to form different dynamics between characters. We can think about, you know, whether two characters will be friends, whether they will love each other, whether they will despise each other, whether they will have a more complicated relationship, which is more tense and kind of ebbs and flows, or whether it will start off, you know, one character hates the other, but very slowly, gradually throughout the story, they fall in love. You know, there are many different ways we can explore how our characters feel about each other, and that it's really good fun to do that, and it just adds these multiple dimensions to our characters. We're building kind of 3D characters or 4-dimensional characters, real life, authentic characters. So let's build on that some more by looking at contrasts and contradictions, because this is where it gets even more interesting. So just to recap, we have talked about building a visual identity for a character. We have also talked about how we can describe our characters' actions and the manner in which they perform those actions. We've also talked about giving our character a tone of voice, a way of speaking, of communicating, of interacting with other characters. And then we've talked about how they form relationships with other characters. Now let's build on that further by looking at the contrasts and contradictions, because after all, we want our characters to feel real and authentic. And in real life, all of us as human beings, we all have flaws. We make mistakes. We say the wrong thing. We perhaps sometimes will say one thing but do the other. And that's what makes us human. That's what makes us real. And we want our characters to kind of reflect that. Often in writing children's books, like the age I write for, which is kind of novels for 8 to 12 years old, you can read lots of articles which say, when you're writing for that age group, just focus on the narrative, focus on lots of action, fast-paced. Don't worry too much about the depth of the characters or describing the setting, the environment. I actually think that is a lot of nonsense, because I think whoever you write for, we should always aim to create really interesting and characters that the reader kind of either loves or hates or loves to hate. So I think that's important, and it helps us to create characters that are avoid stereotypes and cliches. That it's all being done. It's a bit boring and predictable. So by really thinking about the complexity of characters, we can make them feel real. So a classic example of a contradiction or a contrast within a character is, two friends, and one of the friends, they're best friends, but one of them is doing something behind her best friend's back. That's a classic example of a character saying one thing, but then doing the complete opposite, doing something different. Or it could be a character who, on the face of it, is a really good and trustworthy and loyal person, but they are completely obsessed about achieving a particular goal or ambition, and they will sacrifice anything to achieve that goal. And that's that character's flaw. That's their Achilles heel. Or another example could be a character who at first might appear to be very loud and brash, but in fact is actually very insecure. And that loudness is all a bit of an act, and it's a cover-up. And so, as we, can create these different layers to our characters, they can resonate with our readers, and our readers can maybe relate to some of that. Let's bring back Boris and Barry with their cup of coffee. Let's enter the same scene, but this time I'm going to add some contrast and contradiction between the words and the action. So let's see. So this is example number 1. "This is ridiculous," huffed Boris as he slammed the coffee cup on the table and let out a heavy sigh. "You'll be great, Boris," smiled Barry. "I have every faith in you." Boris left the room, closed the door, and smiled. He had Barry exactly where he wanted him. So that's example 1. Example 2 is, "Thank you so much, sir," replied Boris as he carefully placed the coffee cup on the table and smiled. "You'll be great, Boris," smiled Barry. "I have every faith in you." Boris left the room, closed the door, and phoned his mystery contact. "Sir, we have a problem." So with those 2 examples, we have the polar opposites. The reaction of Boris in front of Barry is completely different to how Boris is really feeling. And because here, into this scene now, we've added some contrast to the character. there's a difference between what the character is saying versus how he really feels, and maybe the actions he may take further down the line in this non-existent story. It's not a real story, it's just an example. And that adds a sense of intrigue for the reader. You know, they can see here that Boris is clearly up to something in both examples, but he's just using a different approach. So not all characters are going to be like this as well. You know, it's something to consider when you are creating your characters and writing stories. That can happen pretty organically. Actually, it's not something that, you know, when you first you get an idea for a character, you don't need to think about all of this immediately. This is something which you can just consider as you begin to fit your character into the wider jigsaw puzzle of your story. Because when we do add these layers of personality and complexity, we can add some tension and drama, atmosphere, and we can really draw the reader in. It also allows the characters to evolve and change and develop through the story. And, you know, it's so good to see a character develop, and we go on that journey with the character. The classic example is kind of the underdog character, isn't it? If I think of children's books that I love, you know, classic example is Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. You know, you've got this you know, little boy who's from a very poor family, who is quite quiet and reserved, but he goes on this journey, and you can see the way he progresses and develops and grows throughout the story. And as a reader, you go on that journey with Charlie, and so, you know, that's quite special. And this is kind of what we want to kind of create when we think about developing characters. And by thinking about those changes in their development throughout the story, we can do that. So it could be overcoming a fear, or it could be a character becoming more confident or understanding or softer in nature. But we do bring our readers along on that. So it's important to think about these contradictions and contrasts within characters when we are writing our stories. So that brings us to a close on characterization. I appreciate there's a lot of information there. So let me just kind of recap on that. So there are four like main buckets that we can consider when we create characters. One is descriptions, so describing their physical appearance, but also describing their actions, the things that they do in the story. And they can be small things like putting a cup of coffee on the table, or they can be big things like, I don't know, burning down their own home, for example. But we describe that and the manner in which we do them, which elevates that particular character. The second thing we can think about is their tone of voice. How does the character speak? What types of words do they use when they speak? And, you know, how do they communicate to others? And again, we want this to reflect the character's personality. Number three is the relationships that characters have with one another. And this is where we can start to, you know, unpeel those layers of personality on our characters and kind of dive a bit deeper and bring out, you know, those different feelings or emotions within our characters. We create different dynamics between our characters. And then number four is building on that further, is the contrasts and contradictions within characters. All people have flaws. We are not perfect, and, you know, we want our characters to reflect that. So these are four things that we can consider when we create characters. And like I've just said, you don't need to, you know, if you get an idea for a character, it's not like you need to think about all of these things immediately. and think, right, how am I going to describe them? What voice am I going to give them? You just kind of live with the character for a little while. You know, let the character write the idea down, of course, on paper, but just let the character live in your mind, and just explore different options and think, wouldn't it be fun if the character had a Scottish accent, for example? Or wouldn't it be fun, you know, if the character wore really bright clothes, even if they have a very dull speaking voice? So there's all of these different things that you can think about when you're first kind of creating characters in your mind as a general concept. And this is the beauty of creativity. It's fun. You can go anywhere with it, and kind of think about it. So hopefully that helps, and hope you can join us next week for the next workshop, which is on settings. So how we can create an environment where our story will be told and our characters will kind of live. So thank you very much. Take care, and stay safe.